welcome to the Book Bunch. Today we're going through the second half of all the books that I read in January. There is quite a substantial stack here, so we'll get right into the video. My name is Sam, and if you're new to my channel, I'd like to say a very special welcome. And if you're a returning viewer, I'd like to say thank you so much for remaining in this community. It means so much to me. So let's get on with the video. The first book that I read in this part of the video is Treasure Island. So I had never read the original version of Treasure Island. I've read adaptations and watched movie adaptations of it, retellings, that kind of thing, but I've never read the original. It was really, really good. So essentially it is the original pirate story, or one of the original pirate stories. It talks about this young man who is really kind of a boy more than a man, and he lives with his family in this inn, and this pirate named the captain basically is a permanent tenant of this inn, and he has lots of secrets. And basically, he is being hunted, or is basically in hiding from these people who were his old crew, because he found this ridiculously big treasure and has this treasure map, and he doesn't want them to get their hands on it. So he's kind of gone into hiding. And so he gets this boy to watch out for these people as they come into the inn to see, like, if he's been found, basically. So he does end up being found very early on in the book, and he actually ends up dying from a heart attack or a stroke because he drinks way too much alcohol, and the town doctor tells him that he needs to stop, but he doesn't. And so the alcohol, as well as the stress of being found, leads him to basically having a fatal heart attack. But not before he kind of tells the young boy where to find the treasure and gives him the treasure map and all of that kind of thing. So then it's decided that the young boy is going to go along with a couple of the men in the town, as well as this town doctor, to find this treasure. And so they go to hire a pirate crew, or at least a sailing crew. And yeah, it's basically their journey of finding this treasure without hopefully too many people finding out, and kind of their journey through that. They end up making it to the island, and it's also about what kind of ensues on the island when they get there and find the treasure and all the rest. So yeah, it was a really good book. It really enlightened me in regards to, you hear similar pirate names popping up here and there, but for the most part I didn't really know who they were in the lore of pirates. But this book kind of clears all of that up, because different pirates have different nicknames and lots of things, and some of them are known by multiple different names. So it kind of put all of that into perspective, some of which are actually referenced in Peter Pan, which was another book that I read this month, which we'll talk about shortly. But yeah, basically it was a really good book. I did enjoy it. I'd probably give it a 3.5 to 4 out of 5 stars. It was a really solid classic. I would definitely keep this one in my collection. And as I said, I also read Peter Pan this month. I read the original because I'd never actually read Peter Pan before. I had only seen the movies, and the movies were so awesome and so special to my heart because I watched them as a child, that it was a real privilege to read the original copy of the book. I would say this book does not age well. It's very much so not politically correct, and there's some definitely sensitive things that would no longer be acceptable nowadays to write about or describe in such a way. But it's still a really good story. I definitely see why this is a beloved classic. I definitely recommend reading it to your children and all of that kind of thing, as has been done for many years. But yeah, just be aware that there's some some things in there, basically racism, that you should probably explain to your children that is no longer acceptable. It should have never been acceptable. And yeah, so in that respect, it doesn't age well. But I feel if you explain that beforehand, you can still get some joy out of reading this classic. It's also the writer himself is actually really good writer. Like he's quite funny, and he writes in a really interesting style that I haven't read before. So I really enjoyed the style. I just obviously wish he had been more sensitive about different things, even though I know it was a different time. But yeah, really good classic. Definitely recommend it. I'm not going to really explain Peter Pan to you guys because I'm sure everybody on the planet knows the Peter Pan story. But yeah, basically, Peter Pan is the immortal boy who lives beyond the stars in Neverland, and he comes and picks up Wendy, John, and Michael, and they go and have an adventure in Neverland. But yeah, very good book. I also read Anne of Green Gables this month. This is actually the very first book that I read in January, because I didn't end up getting to see my mum over the Christmas holidays like I had hoped. And I still haven't actually got to see her yet, so I thought I would read this one on my own and reread it for a third time, with her at another later date. But yeah, I reread Anne of Green Gables. It was so good. Still just as good as I remember it being. And I was surprised at how quick moving it was. I feel like as a kid and even watching the movies, all the events and the stories are very far apart in regards to how long it takes you to get through. But this was just like one after the other. And so I knew everything that was happening. And it was such a pleasant read. I love this book. I highly recommend it to anybody. It's a 5 out of 5 stars for me. This is probably one of my favorite classics of all time. Basically, this follows an orphan named Anne, and she gets adopted out, and it's basically just her growing up, and experiencing Green Gables, which is the area that she lives in. And well, she lives in Avonlea, but Green Gables is like the farm that she lives on. And yeah, it's all about her childish adventures and experiencing school and friendship, and there's some trials and different things, and she's a bit of an outcast, and it's basically about how the whole town ends up falling in love with her, even though she is so out of their ordinary. And yeah, it's just a really beautiful story. I also read The Silmarillion. I am going to be doing a separate review on this to kind of break this one down. Not only because I feel like it deserves its own video, but also because obviously the Rings of Power has been announced, and that is all about this basically. So The Silmarillion is kind of complicated and difficult to read. It is basically all of J.R.R. Tolkien's notes of all the lore and the history behind The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit that he didn't necessarily want to put in those books, but he wrote them out to help him understand the world that he was creating. And then when he passed away, his son Christopher went through, found these notes, and then compiled them into somewhat of a cohesive story. But again, it's heavy on the history of Middle Earth and the realm and all of the creatures that live in Middle Earth. So it is a bit more like reading a history book than reading a like fun adventure story like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. That being said, it is packed with lots of adventure and little tales along the way. I did enjoy it, but like I said, it was a bit difficult to get through. So it actually took me a couple of days, like a number of days, to read it, just because I only really wanted to read small bits at a time rather than just sitting there and devouring the whole thing like I normally do. But yeah, you'll hear more about it in my upcoming review. I then read another classic. This is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Other Tales of Terror. So this is the original telling of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I had never read the original before. I know of the story because it's obviously a classic, so people talk about it. I did when I was a kid. There used to be a show on ABC Kids that was like a retelling of Dr. Jekyll and Little Hyde and Mr. Hyde if they were brothers. Um, and it was like animated, and that was quite fun. And they just like would have adventures in their backyard, and do science experiments and things. But this is very different to that. Yeah, basically this follows the um, kind of horror story, I guess you'd say, of this man who is a lawyer, and he is basically telling you what has happened to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And basically, he is best friends with Dr. Jekyll, and they're kind of like middle-aged kind of men, so they've lived for quite a good amount of time. So they've had a friendship for a long time, and he suddenly notices that Dr. Jekyll is acting weird, and that his friends kind of almost changed direction, and this new man has entered Dr. Jekyll's life named Mr. Hyde, and he doesn't like Mr. Hyde. He thinks he's a bad influence and just not a really good person. And the lawyer is concerned because Dr. Jekyll has signed over all of his belongings to Mr. Hyde on event that he goes missing for 3 months or longer or dies. And so it's basically this about this lawyer trying to change Dr. Jekyll's mind and find out what's actually going on and get rid of Mr. Hyde. And partway through the story, Mr. Hyde is actually found to have murdered somebody in cold blood, and so he's wanted. And so this lawyer is trying to help Dr. Jekyll and keep him away from Mr. Hyde. And there's this whole mystery that goes along with it, but I'm not going to spoil that for you because that is the big twist in the book. And then there is also a couple of shorter stories in this novel as well, which are the other tales of terror, which are completely unrelated. They're just, other horror-y type short stories. They're not too bad. Won't really talk about them though because they're not like I barely remember them because they weren't that exciting. So yeah, I would only recommend really picking this up if you want to read the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde part, but the rest of it is kind of blah. But overall, I'd probably give the book 3 out of 5 stars. Wasn't amazing, wasn't terrible. I'd probably hold on to this one, but I'm not too sure. And then also for this month, I read 3 of H.G. Wells' books. I have done a whole review on this and on H.G. Wells' books where I go into a bit of detail. So if you would like to check that one out, please do. So I read The History of Mr. Polly, which I have a little vintage edition, which I got for like $2 from the Lifeline Book Fest. I did not like this book. As I said in my other review, it was just kind of boring. It's very similar to George Orwell's Coming Up for Air, which I didn't also love. Basically, it just follows this guy named Mr. Polly, and it's just a short segment of his life. It basically just talks about how he's this middle-aged guy, not super happy with his life, not super happy with the job or his marriage. He's a bit bored. So he basically has a midlife crisis and runs away from home, and like kind of what happens there. Then I read The Shape of Things That Come. I also did not like this book. I didn't even finish it. I DNF'd it because it was just ridiculously hard for me to read. It's very political, but mostly talking about either fictitious politics or politics that are from the early 1900s, which I don't really know much about. I wasn't alive then, and I don't really care for politics, so reading about it so heavily was very difficult. It was almost like reading a textbook about politics, and so it kind of went over my head. I also didn't love his writing in this one either. Like, Normally he writes really beautifully and I love it, but this time around I did not like it. He had ridiculously long sentences with crazy words that I didn't understand. Then finally I did The First Man in the Moon, which I did like. I did like this one. I do recommend you guys read it if you love sci-fi. It's basically H.G. Wells's version of what it would be like to go to the moon, because this was written well before anyone did actually go to the moon. So he made up what he thinks the moon would be like and traveling to the moon would be like. So they travel through through space in this metal ball that is made of metal and glass, and it's got these flaps on it that you can open and shut, which basically work as fins or ailerons so that you can kind of push yourself and direct yourself through space. And you're being lifted up through this like gas type substance that some scientists have stumbled upon. And basically, these two guys go to the moon and experience what it's like on the moon. There's all these plants and crazy wildlife, and then they actually encounter these insect-like creatures that live on the moon that have their own society. And yeah, it's all about their kind of adventure on the moon as the first men in the moon. So yeah, it was really good. Definitely recommend it. And it was a lot of fun just to read about what someone thought the moon would be like without anyone ever having experienced the moon before. So that was really cool. So they were all of the books that I read for January part 2. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below if you read any of those books yourself, if you want to read any of those books yourself. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I hope you guys have a great week. Bye!